Hi, I'm Ian. I'm otherwise known as Two Eyes by someone who gave me a nickname 25 years ago because I have two eyes in my name. But I do archaeology and very happy to be here and Hajka CM to the Leadership Council and the team that put this together. It's incredible to see a room like this about a fish that has so much power and depth in the human history of the Pacific Ocean. Here's a photo of taken from a plane up near Bella Bella, and the Gladstone Reconciliation Society won the right, of course, to commercially distribute roe on kelp and demonstrated that right. Is there enough fish for them to pursue that right, as they have done for 14,000+ years? I want to talk a little bit about the archaeology. Of course, archaeology is human history that disproportionately has a lot of food in it. In the coastal sites around here, ancestral village sites, places people lived long enough to leave a landform or a house platform and build that up over thousands of years. So there's many places on the coast that we know and nations know where their places are. And then there's places that are even older, up the hills or under the water when the former sea levels were lower or higher very, very long ago. But I have a question. What is 1,000 years to you? Like, that's a question that can be asked in archaeology, but it is hard to wrap our heads around what 1,000 years is, let alone 14,000. So how many human generations in a century? How many human generations will it take to get to a point where there's so much abundance that people can practice their ways again? So just want to leave you with that question and see if I can make this slide go forward. Hey, I did it. I have spent 20+ years trying to think about fish bones in archaeology. Tiny little bones that fall through most of the screens that normally people use when they're doing archaeology because there's so many bones. Now, I got a chance to pull information together from Southeast Alaska, up by Sitka, down to Southern Oregon, and where archaeologists have collected information. It's a very limited sample of only 222 sites where we have fine screened proper fish data that have been identified in a lab and counted and speciated or taxa related genus or family level designations, because a lot of these bones are super old and they're not fossils. They're not even, like, they're just old bones in old ancestral places. And the most important, most frequently occurring fish happens to be what we're talking about today. There's lots of other fish that fed people for generations on generations, but herring has been a vitally important fishery for millennia. 3, 4, 5, 10,000 years. There is a lot of history embedded in the presence of a certain taxa here. But yeah, so 98% of the 200 sites had herring. Herring is the single most numerous fish in the majority of these. So 11 years ago, this week, I was part of a paper that came out that talked about the history of herring fisheries and the access that people had to the herring fisheries and spawn. And it made some headline once or twice, but nations up and down the coast that year were furious with the allocation that was opening up those fisheries and made some major statements about that. And it got curtailed and it got pushed, and we're still at that space. I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about herring around here, because one of the big problems, of course, with the challenges of managing a resource is this spatial scale at which you are dividing up where fish are and where fish are reproducing. Of course, the big scales that are needed in management of the whole BC coast, for instance, might be so big that it just doesn't really clue in on these little bays or these populations that everyone has been talking about and sharing, the knowledge that has been shared and passed on. So this is a scatter plot of percentages of fish bones of herring versus all others. And the box plots are, the middle 50% of cases, and the whiskers are the 75 percentiles. Anyway, the little line is the median. So this is a way of comparing 79 sites in the Salish Sea that have this kind of data. There's a lot of herring relative to all other fish. This is just bones, right? It's not fish itself, like individual fish. These are individual bones. That's where we're at with archaeology. And this weird green thing in the bottom is where we are. So diving into the Salish Sea, which is the place of most abundance over the last 3,000 years of data presented here, there's an inordinately high number of herring bones in sites all along the east coast of Vancouver Island, up on the Eastern Strait. In the Fraser Delta, Puget Sound, not so much. There's a lot more fresh water over there, but there's still some interesting spawning activity perhaps, or at least fishing effort. So the Salish Sea is, from Alaska to Oregon, the center of abundance of this fish. Oh yeah, that's what that is, the Salish Sea. So I just want to zoom in a little bit further. And so one of the things we were able to do in this paper 11 years ago is to sort of take where DFO have monitored spawn activity over the last 100 years in some cases. They've been, there was this wonderful atlas that was put out by Doug Hay with the DFO about where this activity occurred, and time series that go back. But the management baseline is really hard on 1950. But before 1950, there's some spawning activities, and they were in that database. So I looked at where we have archaeological sites. There's many more. This is 0.1% of the sites that have this kind of information. The rest of them are out there. We could ask questions about those sites. Where are their superabundant herring? Where are their superabundant geoduck, etc.? This is a layer of the ancestors doing labor to feed their families for thousands of years. That's knowledge, that's tradition, that is science-y. They have perspective. These bays have archives of histories in layers, usually under the really expensive development down by the water. But, a lot of those data points are that, right? So archaeologists and nations, many in the room here, have done work on their ancestral villages and have put fish bone counting in the list of priorities. Small screens, smelts, and oolikins, and all that interesting sand lance. There's some really great information out there all around us. But there's only a handful of these data points that have been reported under controlled and systematic identification and recovery and so on. So here's, on the left, abundance. Look at all these red diamonds. This is just the shape I picked. But on the right is places where there are so many herring relative to all others they are connected by less than 2 meters away from a known spawning area. So is spawning happening? Can we see spawning through the archaeological record? So we did a bit of a test, and yeah, there's a statistical association between places that have lots and lots of herring and spawning areas, but there's some places that are not even monitored, like, Dallas Road or Willows Beach. There's a big village, downtown Victoria, Ogden Point. They have lots of herring in the past, and there's a lot of transformation of the foreshore. And lots of people are driving their cars around. And anyway, there's a layer of history to inform our knowledge of not just this fish was really important, but where is this habitat? So I just want to open that conversation and say, Bryony has posted a thing on, iNaturalist. So if you see spawn, post it on iNaturalist. And that's kind of really a good effort, especially in these areas that haven't been monitored. And it's like, oh no, there was never spawn. Well, 1,000 years ago, there was a spawn every year for hundreds of years. So that's the kind of thinking. Where could we take this is a resource that could be exploited and build British Columbia? Well, of course, that was a part of the history of colonization and playing up the possibilities in this new place called British Columbia. And just after the border was being established, they were cutting this 49th parallel down here. There is this guy who wrote a book, Vancouver Island in British Columbia, 1866. He says, all herrings in the weirs were not eaten. The great use to which they appropriate them is to extract oil. Oil is super prevalent in herring populations in the fall, not in the spring after the hard winter. Maybe there's a fall fishery. Yeah, there is lots of other evidence there, but he says, without, I'm putting on a Victorian era English voice here, I have no hesitation in stating my conviction that herring fisheries would turn out to be the most remunerative speculations. Okay, it's a valuable fishery. It's valuable to people. It has been for a long time. It's right there at the beginning of what we say is British Columbia. This is Captain Cook coming ashore at Yuquot, and his science naturalist illustrator drawing a picture of McQuinn's house, inside McQuinn's house in 1778, 247 years ago. He's like, oh, they hang them on this is March, spawning time. They hang them on small rods at first about a foot from the fire. They're using boiling stones, and they're putting the hot rocks in their bentwood box, right? Then they remove them higher and higher to the roof. And then they get made into bales and covered with mats. They store very well. So archaeologists have talked about salmon a lot, and salmon are important to many of us. And yet the layer that isn't as clear in the conversations that sometimes are had about fisheries, that herring are kind of core to that. And people knew that, and people want that back. So here's a layer of history that I just welcome all of us to reflect on and know that there's sites everywhere that you could ask the same question about. Or think about all the other things that used to be there for millennia. So fish and fisheries is one layer, but of course, knowledge holders working with archaeologists have been contributing to this. This is 50 years or 70 years of work. It's not me. It's all those places that are disassociated from, oh yeah, well, we did find some fish bones, but no, let's look at all of those layers and together and look at them in a map. That's what I'm very privileged to be doing a little bit of. at UVic and working with nations about that. And I'd like to thank all my collaborators and say Haichka CM and Kleko and Hawa, and happy to talk afterwards. And thank you very much for the space.